Many of the speakers have said that it's a great honor to be here. Honor is an appropriate word, but I think if I were telling somebody about it, I think what I feel here is pleasure and refreshment. The collegiality, the intelligence, the alertness of this group is a pleasure to live in and a refreshment to the spirit. I was thinking, when I was listening to the various speakers who said so many remarkable and interesting things along the way, I kept saying, well, maybe I should talk about that. Maybe I should read this poem, this, that, and the other. So I thought I would start at really basics. I write three kinds of poems. There's the poems that I start but can't finish. There's the poems that I finish but I don't like. And then there's the poems that I finish and I think are good enough to publish. The whole process to me is mostly involuntary. I write the poems the muse brings me. I'm often asked to write a poem about something or this, that, or the other. When I try, it is usually in the first category, then maybe if it's lucky, ends up in the second category. And so, in a funny way, I feel that when I'm writing poetry, I'm taking dictation from the muse or from my unconscious. Since I'm the slave of inspiration, and I imagine there's a kind of predictable, recurrent nature of the things that I write about, I try to make the surface of my poems as different from one another as possible, so that there's something new happening on the surface, even if I'm sort of writing about obsessive themes. Let me start with a poem that I wrote a couple of lines, and then I wasn't able to finish for 20 years. I wrote it when it first happened. By the time that I finished it, it was, the moment was gone and the lives were different. I was raised in Hawthorne, California, a blasted urban landscape. There's probably 3 trees in the entire city. And this is about the first time that I actually went up to Northern California. And the first time, in a sense, I saw nature in spring. It's called The Apple Orchard. And as you'll learn from the poem, I was in love with someone. The Apple Orchard. You won't remember it. The apple orchard we wandered through one April afternoon, climbing the hill behind the empty farm. A city boy, I'd never seen a grove burst in full flower or breathed the bittersweet perfume of blossoms mingled with the dust. A quarter-mile of trees and fragrant rose arching above us, we walked the aisle alone in spring's ephemeral cathedral. We had the luck, if you can call it that, of having been in love, but never lovers. The bright flame burning, fed by pure desire. Such nothing consumed, such secrets brought to light. There was a moment when I reached out behind you to spin me toward you, but I stopped. What more could I have wanted from that day? Everything, of course. Perhaps that was the point, to learn that what we will not grasp is lost. This is a poem. It's a philosophical poem, and it's really about what language can do and what language can't do. I felt especially during the whole rise of deconstructionism, where they say, well, language is an artificial, construction that has no relationship to reality, and that, they were wrong. There's some things language can do, some things language can't do, and we live in a world that is independent of us. And so there's 3 images in the poem that kind of wrap around each other. So, a stone, a leaf, and a kiss. So don't try to follow it. Just lean back and enjoy the tune. Words. The world does not need words. It articulates itself in sunlight, leaves, and shadows. The stones on the path are no less real for lying uncatalogued and uncounted. The leaves speak only the dialect of pure being. The kiss is still fully itself, though no words were spoken. And one word transforms it into something less or other, illicit, chaste, perfunctory, conjugal, covert. Even calling it a kiss betrays the fluster of hands glancing the skin or gripping the shoulder, the slow arching of neck or knee, the silent touching of tongues. Yet the stones remain less real to those who cannot name them or read the mute syllables graven in silica. To see a red stone is less than seeing it as jasper, metamorphic quartz, cousin to the flint the Kiowa carved as arrowheads. To name is to know and remember. The sunlight needs no praise, piercing the rain clouds, painting the rocks and leaves with light, then dissolving each lucent droplet back into the clouds that engendered it. The sunlight needs no praise, and so we praise it always, greater than ourselves and all the airy words we summon. Let's see. Try to write down things too. This is a poem that was a poem I wrote and I wasn't going to publish. I just seemed to be, it was, I don't know, I wasn't quite sure. I think it was just too inside of things. And then, the first person I showed it to, loved it. And then, so other people seemed to respond to it. It's called Prophecy. Sometimes a child will stare out of a window for a moment or an hour, deciphering the future from a dusty summer sky. Does he imagine that some wisp of cloud reveals the signature of things to come, or that the world's a book we learn how to translate? And sometimes a girl stands naked by a mirror, imagining beauty in a stranger's eyes, finding a place where fear leads to desire. For what is prophecy but the first inkling of what we ourselves must call into being? The call need not be large, no voice in thunder. It's not so much what's spoken as what's heard and recognized, of course. The gift is listening and hearing what is only meant for you. Life has its mysteries, annunciations, and some must wear the crown of thorns. I found my Via Dolorosa in your love. And sometimes we proceed by prophecy or not at all, even if only to know what destiny requires us to renounce. O Lord of indirection and ellipses, ignore our prayers. Deliver us from distraction. Slow our heartbeat to a cricket's call. In the green torpor of the afternoon, bless us with ennui and quietude, and grant us only what we fear, so that underneath the murmur of the wasp, we hear the dry grass bending in the wind, and the spider's silken whisper from its web. There was a couple of interesting conversations that went on in the last 2 days about persona. And someone asked, well, how do you, get the authority or feel the confidence to assume a persona, and how true is it, in a sense, to who you are? And I'll answer the two questions. Once somebody asked me, I wrote an essay, actually, it was about 3 long poems, one by Anthony Hecht, and I talked about what I thought were the best long American poems of the 70s and 80s, last quarter century. And someone said, "What gives you the authority to say that?" And I answered, "I took it. I said it in public, and anybody who wants to argue with me can argue with me." And that's what literature is. I mean, a writer assumes the authority to speak on something, and if you do a bad job, people will usually tell you. So the first question is, you give it to yourself. And that's part of growing up as a writer, just to be willing to, in a sense, take the weight of authority on yourself. And the other is that it's very hard to be objective about our own voice, talking about our own lives. I mean, we're just too far inside it. So what I like about persona is it allows you to talk about a subject. You can bring anything you want from your life, from anybody else's life, and you can construct, in a sense, a voice which enlarges what you can talk about. I mean, Frank, face it, if all you could write about is your own life, most of us don't have more than one book, and maybe not even that, and so, it gives you a chance, in a sense, to try things on, and I think that's a more interesting writer. So, I've always tried to think of poetry the way a short story writer thinks about things, putting it together. This is a poem in a very odd voice. It's a voice of a statue in a museum. The statue is a santo. Those of you from the Southwest, Mexican homes have these wooden images that are carved of the Virgin, the crucifix, of saints, and they put them in their home, and they're objects of devotion, or they're in rural churches. They're not signed. Nobody knows who the artist is. The nicer ones, the bigger ones, that weren't destroyed in the Mexican Revolution, because the Mexican Revolution, they looted the churches and they burned almost all of them. And this is one who has actually survived the revolution. He's been damaged in the revolution, but he's now in a museum. And he's gone from an object of worship to an object of aesthetic contemplation. The angel with the broken wing, and it's spoken by the angel. "I am the angel of the broken wing, the one large statue in this quiet room. The staff finds me too fierce, and so they shut faith's ardor in this air-conditioned tomb. The docents praise my elegant design above the chatter of the gallery. Perhaps I am a masterpiece of sorts, the perfect emblem of futility. Mendoza carved me for a country church. His name's forgotten now, except by me. I stood beside a gilded altar where the hopeless offered God their misery. I heard their women whispering at my feet, prayers for the lost, the dying, or the dead. Their candles stretched my shadow up the wall, and I became the hungers that they fed. I lost my left wing in the revolution. Even a saint can savor irony. When troops were sent to vandalize the chapel, they hit me once, almost apologetically. For even the godless feel something in a church, a twinge of hope, fear, who knows what it is, a tremor unaccounted by their laws, an ancient memory that they can't dismiss. There is so much I must tell God. The howling of the damned can't reach that high, but I stand here like a dead thing nailed to a perch, a crippled saint against a painted sky. I wrote one poem about my mother early in my career, and my mother informed me that if I ever wrote another poem about her, I was not to come home. Which in her case would not have been an idle threat. And so I wasn't really able to write about my parents until they died. And I think my father would have loved me to write about him, but it was, I took it as a family, a family band. And this is I don't need to explain this poem to anyone because you've been there. I think for the at least those of us of a certain age have been there. It's called Finding a Box of Family Letters. The dead say little in their letters they haven't said before. We find no secrets, and yet how different every sentence sounds, heard across the years. My father breaks my heart simply by being so young and handsome. He's half my age, with jet black hair. Look at him in his Navy uniform, grinning beside his dive bomber. Come back, Dad, I want to say. He says he misses all of us, though I haven't been born. He writes from places I never knew he saw, and everyone he mentions now is dead. There was a large, long photograph curled like a diploma, a banquet 60 years ago. My parents sit uncomfortably among tables of dark-suited strangers. The mildewed paper reeks of regret. I wonder what song the band was playing, just out of frame, as the photographer arranged your smiles. A waltz, a foxtrot. Get out there on the floor and dance. You don't have forever. What does it cost to send a postcard to the underworld? I'll buy a penny stamp from World War II and mail it downtown at the old post office, just as the courthouse clock strikes 12. Surely the ghost of some postal worker still makes his nightly rounds, his routine too tedious for him to notice when it ended. He works so slowly he moves back in time, bringing our dead letters to his lost addresses. It's silly to get sentimental. The dead have moved on, and so should we. But isn't it equally simple-minded to miss the special expertise of the departed in clarifying our long-term plans? They never let us forget that the line between them and us is only temporary. Get out there and dance, the letters say, adding, love always, can't wait to get home. And soon we shall be. See you there. There's two unavoidable. Well, first of all, I'd like to read or recite poems by other people when I read. And how can I be in Florida without honoring Florida's greatest poet, Don Justice? Tom Lux's teacher, I do believe. Very short poem of his, very beautiful poem. I'm sure you all know it, called On the Death of Friends in Childhood. We shall not ever meet them, bearded in heaven, or sunning themselves among the bald in hell. If anywhere, in a deserted playground at twilight, forming a ring perhaps, or joining hands in games whose very names we have forgotten. Come, memory, let us seek them there among the shadows. Justice is just a wonderful poet, Miami born and raised. There's a couple of moments that you cannot avoid in a poetry reading. I'm gonna do both of them. One is to read you a poem you can't understand, and the other is a poem about poetry. Let's get the poem about poetry over first. I think one of the very weird things, both of my sons, God help me, want to be writers. I have advised them from earliest childhood that this is the road to perdition. But I should have told them not to be bank, executives, or not to be dentists, But one of the problems you have is a kind of manic depressive existence. It just comes with the territory. And a perfect example of this is when you're writing a poem, just as you're finishing it, and you're into it, it's the greatest poem ever written. And you're just full of the sheer achievement, of having finished this haiku. Then a couple days later, you look at it and you start to see, it's not quite as good as you thought. You start fixing it, this, that, and the other. And so, but what keeps us going is the sense that our next poem is going to be the greatest poem in the world. That we're just one swing of the bat, away from that, that sort of, Grand Slam homer. And so I've taken the liberty of describing my next poem in a poem called The Next Poem. How much better it seems now than when it is finally done. The unforgettable first line, the cunning way the stanzas run, the rhymes, soft-spoken and suggestive, are barely audible at first. An appetite not yet acknowledged, like the inkling of a thirst, while gradually the form appears. As the poem, each line is said aloud, the architecture of a room, seen from the middle of a crowd. The music, that of common speech, but slanted so that each detail sounds unexpected as a sharp inserted in a simple scale. No jumble box of the imagery dumped glumly on the reader's lap, or elegantly packaged junk the unsuspecting must unwrap, but words that could direct a friend precisely to an unknown place, those few unshakable details that no confusion can erase, and the real subject left unspoken, but unmistakable to those who don't expect a jungle parrot in the black and white of prose. How much better it seems now than when it is finally written. How hungrily one waits to feel the bright lure seized, the old hook bitten. Now, this is the poem you won't understand. So just relax. Treat it as part of life's ongoing pageant. And I love this poem, but we just all been through Christmas when we get pictures of people's baby pictures. And some of these, you see faces that only a mother could love, That doesn't mean the mother doesn't love it. Now, I want to say a little bit about the poem's background. Is that this is about another way, in a sense of how do I say, assuming other identities. I was reading a couple of books about the surrealists. And it's just, they're fascinating madmen. And Tom Lux was talking earlier today about having, sort of this argument, with, in this case, with Russian poetry. And I wanted to write about it, and I realized if you wanted to write about the surrealists, you have to use their voices. So this poem has three voices. The first is the narrator, and he just basically tells you what's happening. The second is, I quote, there's a book called 152 Proverbs of Surrealism that Éluard and Perret published, and I take two of their proverbs. They are, there is always a skeleton on the buffet, and this could be your motto for this evening's reading. I came, I sat down, I went away. And so I end each stanza with a refrain. I love the way that Patricia uses the refrain in her work. And then the third voice is, I simply quote the surrealists. Everything in the poem is true. André Breton, as you know, is the ringmaster of surrealism. Apollinaire is the older poet who's terribly wounded in the First World War. He's the one actually who coins the word surrealism. Picasso and Dali, I think you must know. Éluard is one of the surrealists. Hugo Ball, co-founder of Dada, ended up as a Catholic theologian. Roussel, you probably don't know. He was a Belgian millionaire who squandered his fortune producing surrealist pageants and then killed himself. I trust in an audience this respectable, nobody knows what the Place Pigalle was in Paris, still is in Paris. It's, where the Hoochie Coochie shows were, and you picked up prostitutes. It's on the Ile de la Cité, just off the Ile de la Cité, which also where the Louvre is. I think that'll do it. So just lean back and relax yourself. So you'll be able to tell the difference between the quotations and the narration. I will do the quotations in the voice of Maurice Chevalier. Elegy with surrealist proverbs as refrain. Poetry must lead somewhere, declared Breton. He carried a rose inside his coat each day to give a beautiful stranger. Better to die of love than love without regret. And those who loved him soon learned regret. The simplest surreal act is running through the streets with a revolver, firing at random. Old and famous, he seemed démodé. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. Wounded Apollinaire wore a small steel plate inserted in his skull. I so loved art, he smiled. I joined the artillery. His friends were asked to wait while his widow laid a crucifix across his chest. Picasso hated death. The funeral left him so depressed, he painted a self-portrait. It's always other people who do the dying, remarked Duchamp. I came, I sat down, I went away. Dali dreamed of Hitler as a white-skinned girl, impossibly pale, luminous and lifeless as the moon. Roussel taught his poodle to smoke a pipe. When I write, I am surrounded by radiance. My glory is like a great bomb waiting to explode. When his valet refused to slit his wrists, the bankrupt writer took an overdose of pills. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. Breton considered suicide the truest art, though life seemed hardly worth the trouble to discard. The German colonels strolled to the Ile de la Cité, some to the Louvre, some to the Place Pigalle. The loneliness of poets has been erased, cried Éluard, in praise of Stalin. Burn all their books, said dying Hugo Ball. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. I came, I sat down, I went away. Chard's acknowledgement of Nosferatu, which I wasn't planning to read from, but I thought it would be actually fun. I do a lot of work with composers and musicians. In fact, it's one of the joys of my life to be working with other artisans. So I've written now 3 opera libretti, and I'll read you just and it's a very different experience because when you're writing an opera libretto, or you're writing song lyrics, there's 3 things you have to consider that you don't consider when you're writing for the page. The first is that you've got to write something that is tight enough to be a poem in itself, but not so tightly woven that the composer can't get in and do it. So it's a kind of a different texture than you would write for the page. The second thing, and this is something that it's like people are embarrassed to consider, but if people singing your words, you're not going to understand 100% of the text. And which means, how do you create a text which survives attrition? Now, the way that songwriters have always done this is you use parallel syntax and repetition and things like that. So if you miss a word, you can almost supply it from the context, or you've missed the object or the verb or whatever. And that's part of, that's something too. So, there's certain kinds of ways of doing that. But the most interesting one is the third one. And I was noticing the singer this evening. If you're really a great singer, and this goes back to the question that was asked this afternoon, you've got to become the personality that could sing that song. You've got to become that persona. So the thing is, if you're writing these lyrics, you've not only got to write lyrics, you've got to create from those lyrics the person that singer, the singers are like athletes. They have this tremendous intelligence that isn't really intellectual intelligence. It's physical, emotional, kind of dynamic intelligence. And that singer's got to know who's singing it, what that person wants, what that person doesn't want, where that person's going. And I found that, pretty interesting challenges to work with. This is the love song from Nosferatu. This is the vampire's love song to the woman he is courting, who must come to him. And so he's got to, in a sense, describe himself as a plausible lover, by which, and the argument that he makes to her is that, and I'll make this to you. Most of us have felt lonely most of our lives. We felt out of place. We feel like we have powers that we dare not acknowledge, or that other people don't value. We have this kind of darkness inside of us. And what he says is, that's the part of you that I'm speaking to. I am the darkness that completes what's in you. And I should just simply say, generally, it's bad to follow the advice of a vampire. Nosferatu's Serenade. I am the image that darkens your glass, the shadow that falls wherever you pass. I am the dream you cannot forget, the face you remember without having met. I am the truth that must not be spoken, the midnight vow that cannot be broken. I am the bell that tolls out the hours. I am the fire that warms and devours. I am the hunger that you have denied, the ache of desire piercing your side. I am the sin you have never confessed, the forbidden hand caressing your breast. You've heard me inside you, speak in your dreams, sigh in the ocean, whisper in streams. I am the future you crave and you fear. You know what I bring. Now, I am here. Right now I'm writing a jazz song cycle with the pianist Helen Sung. God, she's a great pianist. The trouble is, neither is quite sure what a jazz song cycle is, so it's an interesting, we're trying to invent a kind of a genre. This is a poem that I wrote, and I wanted to write a poem that could work on the page, but was as transparent, as a song lyric. I love to write poems that use slang, and this poem is made up entirely, pretty much, of slang. It's called Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's turned lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. There's a couple more poems. I mean, mostly do love poems in one sort of elegy. You can see that, you know, what I really like to do, I like the kind of old-fashioned music that you can make and the kind of noises you can make. I mean, I'm really an auditory poet when you put words together. And so I've always had this, you know, this wish I could write like the Romantics, you know. Imagine writing a poem that begins, "Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I'm here at the gate alone. And the spice of the woodbine is wafted aloft, and the musk of the rose is blown." I mean, like, wow. You know, I mean, who wouldn't want to write like Tennyson, you know, if we could? The trouble is, you know, for, 15 years I've worked in an office, selling desserts and soft drinks. Didn't have many occasions to write in the high romantic vein. But then I came across a tragic love affair. Broke my heart. And I felt somebody should, write a poem. And since Lord Tennyson was not living at this hour, I took it on. I'll describe the romance. A friend of mine had a superannuated orange tabby named Fred. Actually, the person who had the cat is Chase Twitchell, a poet some of you may know. And she decided to brighten up Fred's twilight years by bringing him home a child bride. And the young cat was enormously smitten, by Fred in this May-December marriage. But unfortunately, it proved too late in December for Fred to reciprocate. And so every month, the young cat would go into heat and chase Fred around the house and garden, and nothing ever happened. And so I wrote, this is in the poem of the younger cat, so I've appropriated a female voice. Come into the garden, Fred, for the neighborhood tabby is gone. Come into the garden, Fred. I have nothing but my flea collar on. And the scent of the catnip is gone to my head. I'll wait by the screen door till dawn. The fireflies chord in the sweet gum tree. A night jar calls from the pine, and she seems to say in her rhapsody, "Oh, mustard brown Fred, be mine." And the full moon sets my whiskers afire, and the fur goes erect on my spine. I hear the frogs in the muddy lake croaking from shore to shore. They've one swift season to soothe their ache. In autumn, they sing no more. So ignore me now, and you'll hear my meow as I scratch all night by the door. My wife asked if I wrote that about my kid brother, but it's not true. I write story poems, and I don't want to. I tended to read Haunted, but it would have taken half the reading. So I'm going to read a new one. It's rather short. It's rather odd, though. I love poems that are kind of half sound, half nonsense. If you know, no one remembers Edith Sitwell anymore, but she wrote a lot of these poems, called Scottish Rhapsody. Oh, do not take a bath in Jordan, Gordon, on the holy Sabbath, on the peaceful day, said the huntsman playing on his old bagpipe, boring to death the pheasant and the snipe, boring the ptarmigan and grouse for fun, boring them worse than a 9-bore gun, till the flaxen leaves where the prunes are ripe, heard a tartan wind a-droning to the pipe, and they heard Macpherson say, "Where the winds go, what hotels, hide their umbrellas and their gay umbrellas, and would there be room? Would there be room? Would there be room for me? There is a hotel at Ostend, cold as the wind without an end, haunted by ghostly poor relations of Bostonian conversations like bagpipes rotting in the walls. And there the pearl ropes fall like shawls with the sound of marine waterfalls. And another little drink would induce a calm, pierces through the sabbatical calm, and that is the place for me. So do not take a bath in Jordan, Gordon, on the Holy Sabbath, on the peaceful day, or you'll never get to heaven, Gordon McPherson. And speaking purely as a private person, that is the place, that is the place, that is the place for me. I think Edith Sitwell deserves a comeback. I mean, I think the gal is just great, but say that in an English department, you'll be stoned. But I like the kind of way that, her poem kind of half makes sense, and half doesn't. It's about the dreadful seaside resorts of England, but it's, and this is a poem that it's got two voices. One's on the page, one's italics, the other one's, and it tells a story, but there's also a voice that comes in commenting about the story. I don't think it needs any explanation except that there's one phrase I've been waiting my whole life as a writer to use, and I used it in the poem. I'll tell you what it is afterwards. It's called film noir. It takes place in California, kind of, Central Valley. Film noir. It's a farm town in the August heat, with a couple of bars along Main Street. A jukebox moans from an open door, where a bored waiter sweeps the floor. A bus pulls up by Imperial Fruit. A guy gets off in a new prison suit. He's not bad looking, medium height, full of ambition, not too bright. He's a lowlife, he's one of the lost, who's burnt every bridge he's ever crossed. Just out of the slammer, a ticking bomb, the wrath of God and kingdom come. It's the long odds for a roll of the dice, for the big stakes you can't bet twice. The cards get dealt, the wheel spins. At the end of the night, the house always wins. He sees her alone at the end of the bar, smoking and hot like a fallen star. She's a cold beauty with a knowing wink. If she shot you dead, she'd finish your drink. Some guys learn from their mistakes, but all he's learned is to raise the stakes. There's something he forgot in jail, that the female's deadlier than the male. It's tough love from a hard blue flame, and you can't beat a pro at her own game. It's the long con, it's the old switcheroo. You think you're a player, but the mark is you. She's married but lonely. She wishes she could. Watch your hands. Oh, that feels good. She whispers how much she needs a man. If only he'd help her. She has a plan. Their eyes meet, and he can tell. It's going to be fun, but it won't end well. He hears her plot with growing unease. She strokes his cheek, and he agrees. It's a straight shot. It's an easy kill. If he doesn't help her, some other guy will. It's a sleek piece with only one slug. Spin the chambers and give it a tug. The heat of her lips, the silk of her skin. His body ignites, he pushes in. They lie in the dark, under the fan. A sex-drunk chump, a girl with a plan. Now, the phrase I've been waiting my whole career to use in a poem is the old switcheroo. I heard some old guy hanging around the racetrack say that when I was about 12, and I just said, the old switcheroo, Okay, a couple more poems, and just do 3 more poems, I think. I love the ballad. It's the tune which we use to tell stories. We do it in country music, we do it in folk music, we do it in rock music, we do it in literature. The interesting thing, and this is absolute true, I've never published a ballad without it immediately being attacked by a critic. I don't even have to wait till it comes out in a book. They'll write an article especially. And I think the reason is, and I like that. Randall Jarrell once gave W. Auden a vicious review, and somebody asked, well, Auden, Whiston, what do you think of that? He says, oh, I think it's rather sweet. It means he wants to sleep with me. I don't think these critics want to sleep with me, though. But I do think what it is I think they're embarrassed by the tune. They're embarrassed by the physicality of the language. They're embarrassed that this is a democratic rather than an elite form. Very, very simple. A ballad. It begins at a wedding. It's called Summer Storm. I know it by heart, but only if I have the book open. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry, and we watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars, the storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers, as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as swiftly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the crowd, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word, except to say goodnight. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm, a party 20 years ago? Its disappointments warm. There are so many might-have-beens, what-ifs that won't stay buried. Other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places we never went, as if life might be happier just by being different. My wife and I lost our first son at 4 months, sudden infant death syndrome. And Chard actually wanted me to read a poem about that, but I think one poem about the subject is enough in any reading. And I wanted to read a different one. I don't know if any of you have lost children, but if you have lost children, there's something that happens that I've never seen anybody write about in poetry, but I've talked to other parents and they say, that have gone through this, and the same thing is that, you see a kid that's 4 when your son would have been 4, and then you start to see some 5, and you begin to have a phantom childhood where you start to see kids that are the age that your son would be, your daughter would be. And it's very complicated set of feelings. It's kind of sadness, a kind of joy, a kind of discovery, a sense of loss. And I wanted to write a poem about this. I wrote it on what would have been my son's 21st birthday. I called the poem Majority. Now you'd be 3, I tell myself, seeing a child born the same summer as you. Now you'd be 6 or 7 or 10. I watched you grow in foreign bodies, leaping into a pool, all laughter, or frowning over a keyboard, but mostly just standing, taller each time. How splendid your most mundane actions seemed in these joyful proxies. I often held back tears. Now you are 21. Finally, it makes sense that you have moved away into your own afterlife. Okay? And I want to finish with a love poem, although it's kind of a complicated love poem. I guess that's me. It's got two things going on, and the first thing is I believe that really passionate sexual love that endures is mostly conversation. It's mostly palaver. It's a kind of, that you just, you're in love with somebody if something that happens to you isn't real until you tell your beloved. And, so that, love is this, this gigantic palaver. The second thing that is about this poem is, and this is, I think, brings us to the whole reason why this conference is so important, is that we live by the stories we tell. And as our lives change, we have to change our own story, which means that a successful life, a real life, is a literary creation. And that's why kids from the earliest age need to hear many stories about all the plot turns and elaborations of life, all the characters that come and go, because otherwise they find themselves in a story they don't know how to get out of. That's when people kill themselves. That's when people get in trouble. And so this is about the importance of stories. I take my title from Shakespeare, who said, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact," which is to say all three of them are crazy. But what Shakespeare goes on to say is that the odd thing is that these crazy people see things about the world that sane people miss. This is a double sonnet in a kind of weird form I invented, which is 7, 7, 7, and 7. It's written to my wife, and each time I go to a new stanza, I do a shift and I change the diction and the tone of the poem. I'll do this one without a microphone. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet. The tales we tell are either false or true, but neither purpose is the point. We weave the fabric of our own existence out of words, and the right story tells us who we are. Perhaps it is the words that summon us. The tale is often wiser than the teller. There is no naked truth but what we wear. So let me bring this story to our bed. The world, I say, depends upon a spell spoken each night by lovers, unaware of their own sorcery. In innocence or agony, the same words must be said, or the restless moon will darken in the sky, the night grows still, the winds of dawn expire. And if I'm wrong, it cannot be by much. We know our own existence came from touch. The new soul summoned into life by lust, and love's shy tongue awakens in such fire. Flesh on flesh and midnight whispering, as if the only purpose of desire were to explore its infinite unfolding. And so, my love, we are two lunatics, secretaries to the wordless moon, lying awake together or apart, transcribing every touch or aching absence into our endless, intimate palaver. Body to body, naked to the night, apparel